Hey, welcome to Crossroads. In today's episode, we'll be talking about, well, the looming war with Iran. And right now, President Joe Biden is saying openly the United States will respond. And the concern is now we're going to launch military counterattacks after 3 U.S. troops were killed and more than 30 injured from a drone attack in Jordan. Basically what happened was a drone launched by a terrorist group killed U.S. troops, and Iran is denying involvement, but it turns out the drone came from Iran. Now, some Republicans are supporting the idea of broadening the war in the region. Some are even urging Joe Biden to launch strikes directly on Iran. And as this happens, the United States is also, it seems, planning for nuclear war. We're now planning to station nuclear weapons in the United Kingdom as a deterrent, possibly against Iran, but definitely against Russia. And as this happens, Biden's backing down a little bit and saying that, if we launch counterattacks directly on Iran rather than the proxy forces, we risk making Iran speed up its nuclear weapons development, which I should note is happening shortly after Biden freed up their $10 billion. Now, CNN says this: 3 U.S. Army soldiers were killed and more than 30 service members were injured in a drone attack overnight on a small U.S. outpost in Jordan, U.S. officials told CNN, marking the first time U.S. troops have been killed by enemy fire in the Middle East since the beginning of the Gaza war. In other words, since Israel and Hamas began their war. It says the killing of 3 Americans at Tower 22 in Jordan, near the border with Syria, is a significant escalation of an already precarious situation in the Middle East. Officials said the drone was fired by Iran-backed militants and appeared to come from Syria. News reports now coming out, I should note, are saying that the drone itself was Iranian. Now, it says further on that it is still being determined which militia group specifically is responsible, so we don't have the full answers on it. But U.S. Central Command, it says, confirmed in a statement Sunday that 3 service members were killed and at least 34 injured in a one-way drone attack, meaning they were attacked, they did not counterattack, and it impacted a base northeast Jordan. 8 injured service members were medically evacuated to receive higher-level care, according to CENTCOM, Central Command. It says the number of wounded is expected to rise as well. Biden vowed Sunday to hold those responsible for the attack to account, saying that while facts are still being gathered, and this is Biden saying it, quote, "We know it was carried out by a radical Iran-backed militant groups operating in Syria and Iraq." And again, the concern now is that we could get pulled into a regional terror war in Syria and in Iraq. And keep in mind that as Israel is, of course, defending itself against Hamas and launching attacks into Gaza, it's also expanding those attacks into some of the surrounding countries, including Lebanon. And as this happens, Iran is backing new terror movements, including mainly the Houthis, and they're shutting down some of the Red Sea ports and, of course, shipping channels. Meaning there's a regional terror war starting up that involves multiple countries now. Now, Biden responded to what could happen, saying in an event in South Carolina that, quote, "We shall respond." Watch this.
We had a tough day last night in the Middle East. We lost 3 brave souls in an attack on one of our bases, and we shall respond.
Now, when Biden said, "We shall respond," that was taken by some as meaning, hey, we're going to war. You might have seen some of the rumors circulating around the internet. In fact, some relatively credible sources were saying that as early as last night, it didn't happen yet, that Biden would call up a military draft, that U.S. troops would be gathered from our young men and maybe some women in this country and be sent to war. That has not happened, although, again, there are reports circulating claiming that it will happen. At the same time, Biden appears to be de-escalating a little bit because, of course, there's a big difference between launching attacks on random terror groups all around the Middle East. A lot of that can be done from U.S. ships or using airstrikes or drones. That was Barack Obama's favorite thing. But of course, launching a direct war with Iran is a very different story. It's a big difference between, let's say, going to war against terrorist networks and launching attacks on individual terror groups or weapons emplacements, which is what we're currently doing actually already, versus going to full-scale war with the military of another country, which is what Iran would be. Now, that being said, Joe Biden is backing off of that narrative a little bit. Mirror.co.uk said that U.S. President Joe Biden has been given a chilling nuclear warning over attacking Iran after 3 U.S. soldiers were killed by a kamikaze drone. In my opinion, the word kamikaze is ridiculous here because it was a drone that just crashed and destroyed itself in the target. It says that ex-UN weapons inspector David Albright said the rogue state, Iran, could be led into thinking that building nuclear warheads is their best way out if they are directly targeted by the U.S. in retaliation for the deaths. I should note, Biden himself doesn't seem to be backing off of this too much. He's being warned, though, that if he were to launch direct attacks on Iran, that Iran would very likely respond by increasing their nuclear weapons development. I'd say there are a few holes in that narrative, one of the biggest ones being if we launch attacks on Iran, we'll probably strike their nuclear weapons development facilities, and at the very least, Israel has been saying that they want to do that. Iran is at about 60% uranium enrichment. And in a very short amount of time, they could field a nuclear weapon using what they've already developed. Also, of course, their ability to do this is not being deterred in any way. They've backed out of any agreement that they're going to not do it, although on paper they might still say, we're not developing nuclear weapons. But at the same time, they're telling the U.S. directly, hey, it's essentially none of our business. And of course, as Iran comes closer to developing and even fielding nuclear weapons, this is bringing about some serious concerns given that Iran is the largest terror sponsor in the entire world, although I'd say the CCP is probably a little higher on that list, working behind the scenes. Now look, if you remember what dragged us into the war in Iraq, you might remember, right? It was fake news from the New York Times. New York Times killed an untold amount of young men and women by claiming that Iraq had WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. Turned out it was fake. But the difference, of course, with Iran versus Iraq is that Iran is actually pretty close to being able to build nuclear weapons. In other words, if we went into war with Iraq over the concerns that they had weapons of mass destruction, Iran is openly doing it right now. In fact, they're very close to being able to achieve that. And of course, given this situation and given the rising threat of Iran in the region and around the world, and not to mention, of course, the Hezbollah networks which exist as proxy forces all over the place, including in Latin America and probably right here in the United States, thanks to our open border policies, this would be a very large-scale war were it to happen. Now, given this situation, some of the more Bush-era type Republicans, and keep in mind the way the Republican Party has shifted. During the George Bush era, and I'd even argue into the Obama era, the Republicans were more like the pro-war party. George Bush openly said this many times, I'm a war president. And of course, there are some of those individuals still within the Republican Party who are very pro-war. And some of them are backing Biden and even encouraging him to start a, full-scale war. Meaning that if Biden decides to do this, and I don't know if Democrats will get behind him on it, at the very least he could get enough Republican votes from Congress to be able to expand this. Meaning he would have Republican support probably on a war. Again, though, Democrats might ironically be the ones to block him on it. Now, New York Post says that a slew of Republican polls Sunday quickly called on President Biden to retaliate against Iran after 3 U.S. service members were killed and 34 others wounded in an attack by Iranian-backed militants in Jordan. And here's Senator Lindsey Graham saying, quote, "Hit Iran now, hit them hard." And of course, Lindsey Graham is known for his hawkish views, as it notes. And it notes as well, quote, this is according to Lindsey Graham, "When the Biden administration says don't, the Iranians do. The Biden administration's rhetoric is falling on deaf ears in Iran." And he said as well that Iran is undeterred. The only thing the Iranian regime understands is force. Until they pay a price with their infrastructure and their personnel, the attacks on U.S. troops will continue. Now, I'd say there's maybe a third option here. Of course, we're dealing with two options: do nothing or do something, right? Either let them continue sponsoring terror networks and launching attacks on U.S. troops and sponsoring terror attacks against Israel, which of course all started after Biden freed up $10 billion in sanctions relief for them, you might remember. Or, you know what, maybe launch military attacks on them, destroy them, and probably drag us into a full-scale war with another country. Those are the two options we're being presented with. I'd say there's a third option, which is what Donald Trump did, which is cut off their money, sanction them, eliminate their funds, bankrupt them, and make it so they cannot afford to pay people to launch terror attacks. Even with Hamas, you might remember, Iran pays the families of suicide attackers. If people go and, sneak into Israel and stab children in their sleep, which happens, by the way, Iran will pay the families of that individual after they're killed. That money is coming from Iran. And of course, what happens if you shut down Iran's money? Well, suddenly global terrorism mysteriously comes to a close. And what happens right after Biden gives them $10 billion in sanctions relief? Well, global terrorism mysteriously starts again. And here we are. There's a third option here, which is just renew the sanctions. That's just me, of course. But a bit further on this, regardless of how things go right now, the United States is already getting pulled into the war. We're already in it. There's no falsehoods about this, right? At the very least, we're launching military strikes on terrorist groups in the region. And on Twitter, of course, part of our military, said this. They said, as part of ongoing international efforts to respond to increased Houthi destabilization and illegal activities in the region. Gee, I wonder why that is. It's almost like somebody's paying them to do it. I wonder where that money's coming from. Maybe our sanctions relief, but that's just me again. It says, on January 22nd at approximately 11:59 p.m., U.S. Central Command forces alongside UK, of course Britain, armed forces, and with the support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands, conducted strikes on 8 Houthi targets in Iranian-backed Houthi terrorist-controlled areas of Yemen. These strikes from this multilateral coalition targeted areas in Houthi-controlled Yemen used to attack international merchant vessels and U.S. Navy ships in the region. The targets included missile systems and launchers, air defense systems, radars, and deeply buried weapons storage facilities. Now, what's happening right now? We are very rapidly getting pulled into terror wars in Iraq, in Syria, possibly in Lebanon, and of course in Yemen, and maybe Iran, we'll have to see. But of course, a war with Iran would mean war with all these other countries as well. And of course, I think part of the bets on this are the good old military-industrial complex, which will heavily profit from such a battle. Because as they view it, I believe, this is just a very expensive war. And a very expensive war means a whole lot of business for those arms manufacturers. And a whole lot of business for those arms manufacturers means a long and drawn-out war, which will probably go on indefinitely, which is what the war on terrorism was until Trump oddly ended the whole thing very rapidly. Anybody see ISIS lately, or their whole Levant they tried forming? Whatever happened to ISIS and how they were conquering that entire region and built their own country? Whatever happened to that? Do you remember that? It seems like it ended very quickly as soon as somebody was actually interested in bringing an end to these networks, rather than killing them just enough to let them continue. And of course, also allowing them to get funded, which is, of course, what the sanctions cut off, and the renewal of that money has allowed it to thrive yet again. Now, I'd say that all of this means we're apparently, again, striking military targets already in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria, and possibly more still to come. We're already doing this. This is, as Israel, again, has gotten its war with Gaza, the United States is already getting pulled into this terrorism war. We're already in it. That's just the reality. And Iran, notably, is also pushing the red line for a more direct war. And this is especially as Israel nears the red line on their end on possibly striking Iran on its nuclear programs. And, Israel, they're not really listening to the United States anymore. Biden can tell them, hey, let's start peace deals, and Israel says, we're not listening to you, basically. Meaning they're unpredictable right now, and it's very possible they might go ahead and launch attacks on Iran. I should note that they've done this previously, even when the U.S., at least on the surface, advised them not to. And of course, there have been other methods of bringing down Iran's nuclear development facilities, including, for example, Stuxnet, which was a computer virus that destroyed their centrifuges. The origins of that still unknown, although I think we all know who did it. Now, look, of course, remember that Iran-backed global terrorism, again, is suddenly starting again after Joe Biden gave them $10 billion in cash in November. It was sanctions relief. And let me give you a reminder on that, because I've mentioned it a few times, right? The argument for it was that it was technically already Iran's money. Biden didn't give them money. He just gave them a sanctions waiver that let them access $10 billion. He didn't give it to them. And also, the other argument is that money is fungible. Here's an example. They could say, well, look, Iran can't legally use that $10 billion on terrorism. They can't do it, right? But the issue is, if you free up $10 billion for them to use on other stuff, like food and water or electricity or who knows what else, they can use the money they would have spent on that and fund terrorism. In other words, you pay for one thing so they don't have to pay it, and then the money they would have used for that, they can use that money for terrorism, which they're doing. Here's an example. Someone has $10 for food. You give them another $10 and say, hey, buddy, you can't buy drugs with this $10. And what happens? They can use the $10 that you gave them for food, right? Because you gave them $10 for food, and then the $10 they already have for food, they're going to go buy drugs with. And Iran, basically, as we can see, is already back to its business of sponsoring global terrorism, thanks to that $10 billion they now have to pay for the things that they were going to pay for anyways, and now they have all that extra money. Now, meanwhile, on the issue of global war, the United States is allegedly looking to station nuclear weapons in the United Kingdom. And this is, of course, being done with concerns that Russia is going to expand its war into other countries in Europe. But of course, a nuclear weapon stationed in the UK would also act as a possible deterrent to Iran. This is a pretty serious development. I don't know how people in the UK feel about this, but let me show you. UK Independent says this. Ukraine could win the war more quickly if it had permission to fire British and other Western weapons against targets deep inside Russia, Ukraine's head of Navy has said. It says that the Vice Admiral told Sky News in the UK that the war would have been very different had Ukrainian forces been able to use Western munitions without restrictions from the very start. And they said, quote, "We must have the capabilities to make sure that Russia will give up forever the thought of even looking in Ukraine's direction, including at sea." And meaning, of course, that if they want to look at sea, we'll probably give them some kind of maritime attack or defense munitions, maybe warships even, who knows. It says that earlier it was reported that the U.S. was preparing to station nuclear weapons in the UK for the first time in more than a decade amid a growing threat from Russia. Under the proposals with the nuclear weapons, it says that warheads 3 times as strong as the bomb that devastated Hiroshima would be based at RAF Lincoln Health in Suffolk, according to Pentagon documents seen by the Daily Telegraph. It says these set out plans for a nuclear mission to take place imminently at the base. The MOD, Ministry of Defense in the UK, said it would not confirm or deny the presence of nuclear weapons at any location. Look, regardless, other countries are now preparing for the possibility of a new world war. Now, even outside of Russia, and Russia, of course, is threatening war directly against Poland. The UK is, of course, getting ready to possibly have nuclear weapons pointed at Russia, stationed on its own soil. Germany is preparing for possible war. Many countries in the European, Western European region, especially the Nordic countries, are preparing for possible war. And even outside of Russia, you also have the UK and the old alliance, Australia and so on, also already involved in the strikes against terrorist groups. In other words, if you count the proxy forces and the proxy wars as real wars, we're already at war in multiple regions. And look, other countries now are even floating the idea of mandatory conscriptions. Briefly on this, there are rumors right now, and I'd say credible ones because you've seen some pretty, what I would consider credible news outlets posting things about it, saying that as soon as tonight, and this was last night, that Biden was going to institute a military draft. We have not yet seen that. But there are very real discussions that we could see a military draft in the United States because we have a recruitment shortfall. And other countries now are also talking about a draft, military mandatory conscriptions. Here's Australia just as one example of this, but this is happening in a lot of countries right now. News.com.au says Australia must seriously consider reintroducing conscription to boost its troop numbers in the face of a looming all-out war with Russia, a defense analyst says. And there are many reports like this. It says rapidly rising global tensions in Eastern Europe and the Middle East threaten to drag Australia into an orbit of an open confrontation. This is according to an associate professor of national security and strategic studies at Curtin University. And he added that it may be time for Australia to consider another uncomfortable subject, the return of national service. Meaning you get drafted to serve your country and to die for your nation. And as this happens, of course, U.S. military aid to Ukraine is still caught in limbo. Republicans are using U.S. aid to Ukraine and to Israel, and they've even thrown Taiwan in there now, as a bargaining chip, saying they will not approve the funds until Joe Biden secures the U.S.-Mexico border, and he's just plain old refusing to do it. Not only is he refusing to do it, he's suing Texas and even threatening conflict with Texas, possibly even a civil war, if Texas does not tear down border barriers and allow illegal mass migration into the U.S. The federal government is facilitating human trafficking. They are facilitating an invasion of the United States at a time when we're going to war possibly with terror networks that have very strong presence in these other countries. And look, on a note related to that money, like we've been saying, it turns out there was major corruption in Ukraine and how that money was being used. Lo and behold, remember I talked about this before? My stance on this from the beginning, and I've said it over and over again, I support Ukraine. I believe that Ukraine has a right to defend itself. I understand some technicalities over who done it, and of course the color revolutions that placed Zelensky in power. I'm also aware that Ukraine was regarded as the Wild West of government corruption for a long time. In fact, international money laundering oftentimes went through Ukraine. They are among the most corrupt countries on the face of the earth, especially for Western countries that, again, use it as their money laundering hub. And my concern is this: Russia presents, in my opinion, a larger threat because Russia's talking about national Bolshevism, the fourth political system, the fourth political theory, they call it, which is a merging of fascism, Nazism, with communism. This goes into Alexander Dugin's theory of the fourth political theory. He wrote a book on it, and I read it for y'all. Essentially what he says is he believes that the 20th century has been defined by a war of three political systems: fascism, communism, and liberal democracy. Liberal democracy, he said, has won so far. Communism and fascism went to the wayside. But he believes there needs to be a final war to determine the synthesis that will define the next, 100 years or who knows how long. And in order to create a system capable of fighting against the liberal democratic world order, which is what the United States and other countries are under, he wanted to create a merging of the two rival systems, communism and fascism, into what is called national Bolshevism. Russia has adopted very much the national Bolshevist model. And they've, of course, also aligned themselves with other communist countries, namely the Chinese Communist Party and others, with which they've signed a no-limits agreement. They are, in their eyes, waging the final war against the entire world. And whatever takes place here and whoever wins is going to determine what the future government of the world is. You can choose between two things, basically, freedom or socialism. And that's how they're viewing it. Now, of course, that brings us to Ukraine and the very complicated situation there. I've said repeatedly that if the United States is going to fund Ukraine in good faith, you need to have some kind of system to make sure the money's not being laundered. They're known as one of the top money laundering hubs of the entire world. They're one of the most corrupt countries on the face of the planet. And again, why you see a lot of U.S. Politicians and businessmen there, by the way, and in Western Europe, I should note. I've been saying all along that if you really believe in helping Ukraine defend themselves, make sure the money we're giving them is going to their defense. Troops on the ground should be getting the equipment they need to fight the war. But if you don't have a system to make sure the money's not being used for that, you are not being responsible to the young men who are putting their lives in line to defend their country. And it seems now that Ukraine is admitting that there is wide-scale corruption. And they're at least putting on a show trying to clean things up. I think it's legitimate because they need money. BBC says that Ukraine's security service says it has uncovered corruption in an arms purchase by the military worth about $40 million. I'd imagine it's a lot more than this, but it says this. The SBU said 5 senior people in the defense ministry and at an arms supplier were being investigated. It said the defense officials signed a contract for 100,000 mortar shells in August of 2022. Payment was made in advance with some funds transferred abroad, but no arms were ever provided. Corruption has been a major stumbling block in Ukraine's bid to join the European Union. I've been told by some Ukrainian contacts the reason they don't want to join the European Union is that it's because they have to abide by EU law, which would eliminate a lot of the inherent corruption that just exists there and is part of the way that politics works. But it says further in, the SBU said an investigation had exposed officials of the Ministry of Defense and managers of arms supplier Lviv Arsenal who stole nearly 1.5 billion hryvnias, I don't know how to say that, in the purchase of shells, mortar shells, or artillery shells, I'm sorry. It says, according to the investigation, former and current high-ranking officials of the Ministry of Defense and heads of affiliated companies are involved in the embezzlement. And of course, I'm not saying there's a direct connection with this, but they have all these missing artillery shells in Ukraine and a whole lot of money, right? They're talking about $40 million in embezzlement and so on. Where'd all those mortar shells go? They are mortar shells. Where'd those mortar shells go? And then suddenly the Mexican government is saying, hey, where did the cartels suddenly get all these mortar shells, these American-made mortar shells? That's one of the new reports coming up, by the way. Hey, how did the cartel get U.S.-made artillery? Maybe it's that missing artillery from Ukraine. Maybe they sold it to the Mexican cartels. I don't know. But without a doubt, they're somewhere, and suddenly Mexico, the cartels suddenly got their hands on the same type of munitions. I'm not saying there's a hard line we can draw between these two, but circumstantial evidence suggests that at the very least there's room for some inquiry. And then remember as well, talking about global war, that North Korea is making military threats again. And it looks now that there is a proposal for Putin, Vladimir Putin in Russia, to meet with North Korean Grand Leader Kim Jong-un. South China Morning Post, which has fallen mainly under kind of CCP narratives, has said this. Putin in Pyongyang proposed trip to meet with Kim Jong-un reveals Russia's growing reliance on North Korea. And it says the mooted meeting would mark the Russian President Vladimir Putin's first visit to the North Korean capital in decades, amid both countries' international isolation, suggesting, of course, this is the first time he will meet directly with Kim Jong-un. He met with the former leader. It says that analysts say Moscow's backing has emboldened Pyongyang to challenge Washington and Seoul in South Korea and could redress the military balance on the peninsula. And like clockwork, North Korea is suddenly growing a whole lot more hostile, and they seem like they believe they have the backing of somebody who's going to help defend them if they get like this. Newsweek says that North Korea is escalating test launches, and Kim Jong-un open hostility towards the South suggests that they could be ready to take some form of lethal military action against Seoul, against South Korea in the coming months, according to U.S. officials. In other words, there's a concern that North Korea could actually launch military strikes against South Korea. It says that Jonathan Feiner, the White House Deputy National Security Advisor, said at an Asia Society forum in Washington on Thursday that North Korea had chosen to continue going down a very negative path. While Kim is known to make provocations, Feiner added that the latest escalation of aggressive statements and missile launches should be taken seriously. It notes that North Korea's state media reported Thursday that the country has conducted its first flight test of a new cruise missile, yet another escalation of the threats the country poses to the region. This follows on the heels of them launching, of course, rocket attacks and tests near one of the South Korean islands that is, of course, populated, and South Korea had to evacuate the island. Now, it's hard to say whether North Korea would actually try to launch military attacks, especially against South Korea. South Korea actually is one of the largest militaries on Earth. And of course, they never technically ended the Korean War. They never technically brought that to a close, meaning the two countries are still very much at war. I can say personally, because I was in South Korea for a good while investigating CCP networks. I was also in Taiwan for the elections there, investigating, of course, what the outcome of the elections is going to mean for the world. I was shocked to find that in South Korea, the leftist government, which lost by a very small margin, is pro-North Korea and pro-CCP, meaning nearly half the country, in terms of their voters, supports North Korea. Let that sink in. Half the country, almost, it was a very, very, very narrow election, supports North Korea. And in Taiwan, the rival party to the DPP, the one that won, the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, is the anti-CCP party. They would have lost had there not been a split ticket among the two rival parties, the Kuomintang and the TPP. The TPP and the Kuomintang were going to run as a shared ticket. They couldn't come to an agreement on who was going to lead the party. They actually had an argument during their announcement of running a shared ticket. They couldn't come to that. It was a split ticket. Had it not been split, they would have won. That means the majority of voters in Taiwan is relatively supportive of the CCP, at least to where they believe that they should be working more with China and maybe working less with the United States. What does that mean? It means that in South Korea and in Taiwan, there is support domestically among the population for the countries talking about taking them over by force. The Chinese Communist Party is, of course, talking about military invasion and takeover of Taiwan. The North Korean regime is talking about reunification. They used to say peaceful reunification, but they very recently, within the last couple of weeks, abandoned the peaceful part. They're suggesting now that they want military, integration with South Korea, meaning they want to conquer it. And that would mean the Chinese Communist Party, of course, backing a war in both areas. We're running the war against Taiwan, backing the war with North Korea. And of course, as the United States is getting pulled into multiple conflicts, we would have limited ability to respond to this. And especially if the local populations in Taiwan and in South Korea supported this, it would be very difficult for us to support the 50% divide. It would be very controversial for us, and so this is the challenge we're going to face. Now look, there are reports that North Korea could supply weapons as well to Russia. And so even if North Korea does not launch an attack against South Korea, which they're saying they're going to do, but they've been saying it for a long time, let's put it that way. They've been saying it since the end of the Korean War, even before that. North Korea is actually one of the largest arms traffickers in the world. In fact, they run two of the largest arms trafficking networks in Iran. And of course, one of the red lines America, the United States, drew with the Chinese Communist Party is the CCP was talking about providing military equipment to Russia. If you had a merging of that, the largest landmass in the world, the most natural resources, suddenly coupled with the strongest, largest population and the strongest manufacturing hub of the world, you're looking at a military beast when it comes to manufacturing, and America would not be able to shut it down unless we launch strikes into China. Keep that in mind. It'd be very hard to shut down. And so the U.S. said that is a red line. If China begins supplying military equipment to Russia, we will go to war with them. CCP backed down off of it. But now you have North Korea suddenly providing those arms. And North Korea could work as the kind of laundering hub, let's say the weapons laundering hub, for China to indirectly provide weapons to Russia by proxy. And North Korea, of course, is also supplying weapons to a lot of the terrorist networks, including Hamas, notably. And again, also one of the main arms traffickers operating in Iran. We don't think that much of them in the U.S., but North Korea runs international black markets, counterfeit money, drugs, and weapons. And that's, of course, these are some of the main ways they make their money. There's an international, what you call underworld order. And of course, if you understand that there are multi-billion-dollar economies in the surface world, there are also multi-billion-dollar economies in businesses in the criminal underworld. And you have entire countries, North Korea being one example of that, Iran partly being an example of that, whose economies are based on the underworld order. Mexico, to a large extent, is an underworld order country. A lot of Latin American countries make their money through crime. And of course, the CCP backs a lot of these networks as well. Through their United Front network, they control not only surface economies, but also underworld economies. In fact, they're the main suppliers of precursor chemicals, firearms, yes, in Latin America through Norinco, and also some of the biggest money launderers for the cartels. They're the enablers of the system. They run the drug trade. Now, look, that being said, we're also facing some real terror concerns from our own border, and our very open border at that. Let's not forget about the ongoing threats to the United States through, let's say, just unregulated mass migration into our country. Gateway Pundit says that a group of former high-ranking FBI officials had issued an alarming memo to key government leaders signaling a dire threat to national security. It says they know what is coming. The memo addressed to top congressional leaders and committees outlines a potential invasion of the United States by military-aged men from various global regions, some from countries hostile to the U.S. interests. The memo, signed by retired FBI officials with extensive experience in counterterrorism and national security, have expressed grave concerns about the invasion unfolding within the U.S. borders due to Biden's open border policies. And remember also, Iran, Russia, and China have huge influence in Latin America. This is not talked about much in the United States, but Iran has major presence throughout Latin America. There are Hezbollah political parties in some countries. There are political parties, like we have Republicans and Democrats. They have Hezbollah parties in parts of Latin America. They're also tied in with the Foro ao Sao Paulo, which coordinated, of course, the spread of the pink wave, the leftist governments that took power around the 90s throughout most of Latin America. And a lot of the governments that took power through that are very much aligned with these groups. Remember, there used to be the narrative after 9/11 that the drug trade is, of course, supporting terrorism. And that's because of what you call narco-terrorism. A lot of terrorist networks make their money through opium and through other drugs. And of course, they play a huge role in Latin America through that because that's part of their underworld trafficking network. That's why you have groups like narco-terrorists operating throughout the entire region. And of course, also reports that Hezbollah networks even train Mexican cartels to build IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and smuggling tunnels. They taught them how to build their tunnels. There has even been, of course, talk of training camps in different parts of Latin America for these groups, which are known. Now, remember also, there's growing unrest in countries around the world as well. And people are standing up against the globalist and woke agendas. A lot of people are done with it. They're tired of it. And this is also becoming a global phenomenon. Generally, I think that the farmer protests now taking place, interestingly, throughout most of Western Europe. We see a lot in France. Of course, you might have seen the videos of tractors, for example, dumping manure on the front porches of their politicians and blocking roads and so on. That's not just France. It's actually happening now throughout most of Western Europe. In my opinion, that's relatively a good thing. I think this is farmers standing up against the anti-farming policies, things trying to eliminate, let's say, their ability to use the right amounts of fertilizer, policies trying to force them to kill their cattle, things making it so that they have to either sell their farms or go out of business, or maybe just operate with hardly any profit. And as that happens, you have the United Nations, interestingly, talking about the threat of global hunger. Gee, if you care about global hunger, why are you trying to destroy the farms? Now, throughout most of Western Europe, you have these protests taking place, but that's also creating another issue, which is global destabilization. And given the multiple wars now brewing and the ones already now taking place and the destabilization of the West and the U.S. heading into a very probably difficult election season, there's destabilization, which will act as a window for other countries to, let's say, up the ante in terms of what they plan to do. Add to all of this, again, the reality with our elections and national politics here is going to have its own distractions with all of this, not to mention the fact that even with our border and our other things, we're dealing with a lot. And of course, also the issue of not having enough troops wanting to join the military anymore. Anyways, wild times we're in, folks. I will keep you updated as we move forward through all of this. That said, let's jump into some questions. Let's see here. First up, from No Phobias, Just the Truth. You said they created the problem, then they say they have the solution. Good old Hegelian dialectics, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Never let a good crisis go to waste. The conflict leads forward. Another Hegelian concept. And the negation of the negation destroys something so that something better shall replace it. These are, of course, the foundations of Marxism. Marx pulled it heavily from Hegelian dialectics. Hegelianism being the main metaphysical theory in parts of Europe prior to the rise of Marx. And Hegelianism being, of course, a lot of the concepts of creating revolutions and destabilization in order to usher in new political systems. A lot of what we're watching right now is based on the Hegelian dialectical theory, which is exactly as you mentioned it. Create the problems, then bring the solution, right? If you want to change something, you have to make a problem so that people demand the change you're offering. That's the way it is. That's one of the concerns I have, for example, with crime in the United States. When you have these lawless DAs and prosecutors who are just letting murderers and rapists and everybody else off the hook, while they seem to, throw the book at anybody who's on the other side of the political aisle. One of the issues you have with that is that as they're allowing mass, theft of retail stores, as they're allowing crime, as they're allowing drugs on the street, it seems like you're not really treated that strongly if you do some wild things. You have guys, there was a black guy who drove a car through a crowd and killed white people and openly said that he intended to kill white people, and they let him off the hook. There have been several cases like this, and they're not charged with hate crimes, right? Why is that? My personal opinion is it's not really about race. My personal opinion is there are individuals trying to create chaos in America so that we demand more extreme forms of order. Because once you create destabilization, people start wanting to have a return of order. And that's my concern, frankly. Classic Hegelianism, right? Now, we've had a full episode on YouTube today, just briefly. I'll go into more questions on this. We've had this on Twitter, Facebook, all of you here. But remember, there's a lot of stuff I cannot talk about on these social networks. And so for those things, oftentimes I will put those topics on the days where I'm not on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. And so, of course, that's why we have Epoch TV, EpochTV.com. I will do only partial episodes on, YouTube and so on, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and the full episodes only on Epoch TV. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'll do the full episodes, YouTube and everything else. But having this system lets me cover topics that these networks will censor me for. There are topics like election integrity, let's say, or lack thereof. There are issues like Jan 6, issues like problems with, of course, let's say things I can't talk about on YouTube. Did you all see, by the way, I did this article, I did a video recently about, what was the topic? About the New World Order. And I literally had World Economic Forum panels where they're openly saying, how can we usher in the New World Order? And they're actually saying New World Order. YouTube put a fact check on my video saying that the New World Order is a conspiracy theory. Did you all see that? If you want to have a laugh, if you're on YouTube, go and look up a few days ago where I had the episode on the New World Order and read the YouTube fact check. And then watch the video where I have video clips of these people just saying it. How is it a conspiracy theory when they are saying it? They're not calling it anything else. They're calling it the New World Order. Case in point, there are things I can't tell you on YouTube. So again, come join us on Epoch TV where, again, I can talk about all these things, and I do. And of course, as well, I have my special features there and documentaries and a lot of other great stuff that I'll get censored for if I'm talking about it elsewhere. So make sure you join us again on Epoch TV and, of course, some of the great content we have there. Also, we have I have a new interview out. Dr. Robert Malone, many of you may know him. He has a new show starting with Epoch TV. It's called Fallout, and that's going to premiere this Friday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And I also have an interview with him that I did just recently, and we're going to be airing that Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, only on Epoch TV, so don't miss it. Let me show you a quick word from our sponsor, and then we'll go into more questions. So stay tuned after this, and we'll talk more.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges. With a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold, you can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
All right, welcome back. Let's jump into some more questions. Elizabeth Lucy, you're saying, if there is a draft, will anyone show up? I've seen stats. They say about 1/3 of younger people would not obey a draft. They would choose to not serve. I'm going to be going more into this in the future, but interestingly, we've talked about the military recruitment crisis in the United States. Stats have come out on that, and they're finding they've had a 50% drop in white people joining the military. It's like 40-something%. And, frankly, I'd blame the DEI narratives on that, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I blame the military discriminating against white people. I'd say that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin is an insane racist. He's an absolute racist. And I think that he has discouraged young white people from wanting to join the military because he is an insane racist, frankly. And I think if you join a military where you're run by a bunch of drag queens and racists, you might not want to do it if you believe your values don't align with that. Man, I mean that frankly. You have cross-dressers and stuff like that, is leading our military. And meanwhile they're labeling like evangelical Christians as extremists. Gee, if you're a white Christian, you might not want to join. And frankly, if you're a Christian or somebody just doesn't believe in the stuff in general, you might not want to join. And so, yeah, they're having a military recruitment crisis. Not only that, but a lot of people might have, let's say, some hesitation about fighting the wars we're getting pulled into. There's talk, for example, about war with Russia. I don't think maybe people support Ukraine, but they don't support it enough, I think, to go and die on a battlefield for it. Maybe we have issues with Hamas and Hezbollah and all these guys, but I think for the most part, a lot of at least conservatives understand that we're probably only dealing with this because Biden allowed Iran to access $10 billion. And we believe the solution is not to go and die on a battlefield fighting them, but instead to just bankrupt them. It'd make more sense in my opinion. And so I do think a lot of young men would just refuse to join at this point. And that does raise the question of, well, will there be a draft? I do think that probably a lot of people would still show up, but they would have a lot of people just refusing to serve. And that is becoming a real crisis. I'd say the other side of it is that Biden has demonized patriots. I've even been told this by some folks on the left. They're like, don't use the word patriot. It's become associated with extremism. Since when is being patriotic towards your country considered extremist? If loving your country is considered extreme, then who are the people leading the country? Who are the people saying that loving America is an extremist viewpoint? What do they represent? And how are people who view loving your country as a form of extremism, what do they stand for? Do they not love America? Are they not patriots? Well, why are they labeling patriots as extremists if that's the case? It makes me question who these people are, frankly. And the other side of that on a more practical level is if you demonize your patriots, you're demonizing the fighting force of your country. You're demonizing the people who believe in your country enough to fight for it. And I think that by, again, labeling patriots as extremists, which the Biden administration has done, and the media establishment has helped frame the narrative of, they're making it so patriotic people no longer want to fight and defend the country. J.D. Grillo, you're saying, these criminals want to use illegals for police and armed forces. The fall of Rome. There's a couple issues with that. In the United States, you already do not have to be a U.S. citizen to join the military. In fact, already, military service is a path to citizenship in the United States. It's very much like with, for example, France and the Foreign Legion. You can become a U.S. citizen by joining the U.S. military. The exception to that is if you entered the country illegally. You have to legally enter the United States, then go to one of our recruitment centers, then apply to join the military. I'm not clear whether that legal loophole would include people applying for amnesty who are in line for the amnesty system, maybe, maybe not, or the people granted parole by Biden. But again, we already allow non-U.S. citizens in our military. That is already the case. On the police front, I know in some states they're talking about allowing illegal immigrants and non-citizens to join our police force. While on one side I would say, you know what, if they want to swear an oath to our Constitution and lead an upright life, and I believe generally that police in this country are some of the best people we have. I think that there are some risks with non-citizens as well. Mainly, in most countries in the world, corruption is normal. And I know that this is maybe something for Americans we'd have trouble wrapping our heads around. In some countries, it is part of the normal etiquette that if you go and meet with a government official, you bring a gift. You give them a gift. In America, we call that bribery. In most countries, that's called just respect or something like that. That's just how they operate. If you go to Mexico and you get pulled over by the federales, it's understood you have to give them a bribe. You pay them. This is how they operate. Bribery and that type of corruption is normal. And even in the way that people get promoted in their police department, bribery and paying off your higher-ups is part of the process. You give them a cut of your income every month. That's how corruption works. That's how the world operates in most places outside of America, and with the exception of a handful of maybe Western European countries and so on. Most of the world, corruption like that is normal. And the issue is, if you come to America, look, I would urge you, never try to bribe an American police officer. There's an uncanny, almost unnatural level of just anti-corruption running through the veins of our police. I love them and I respect them for it. It's fantastic. If you try to bribe an American police officer, no matter how much money you offer them, there's a very good chance they will arrest you. They will not take it. And that's one factor that makes American police very different from the police in most other countries. Again, if you go to Mexico and, leave $50 on the seat, it's understood, hey, all right, on your way, muchacho, thank you. If you try to do it in America, you're going to get head slammed against the side of your car and, handcuffs slapped on you. I guarantee it. And so you don't try to bribe American police. You don't do it. Don't ever try it. Not saying they're free from corruption totally. I'm sure there are some individuals out there. But generally speaking, our police have very good integrity. My concern, if you allow people from countries where corruption is normal to join our police force, you're going to start seeing a lot more corruption, frankly. And so I think it's a terrible idea, frankly. Number one, Tonya, you're saying, do you feel there will be a need for a massive war in the U.S. or drawing the U.S. into a war that will weaken us to get us taken over by globalist forces? I do think that is... I guarantee there are some globalist forces who would very much like that. I think they also understand that doing it to Americans is almost impossible because I can guarantee you there is a whole lot of Americans who, if they hear the news that the UN is going to, send the blue helmets to come and, take our guns away, they get excited about it. Like they get excited. They'll have a barbecue and they'll celebrate because they can go stroke their guns and be like, woohoo, the UN is coming, about time, you know what I mean? There's a lot of Americans who would be excited by this. There's something unique about Americans that I think other countries just can't wrap their heads around. We're a very unique people. I've said before, history will remember America as having a warrior culture. We are a military country. We love our military. We love our guns. We love the idea of this type of stuff. This is part of the nature of Americans. When we see tyrants acting like jerks in other countries that we don't even know the names of and we can't even find on a map, we want to go there and beat them up. We want to go fight them. It's something that makes Americans extremely unique in the entire course of world history. I don't know if there's ever been a force like us in all of human history who will conquer a country, beat the living crud out of the occupying forces, and then ask for nothing after we leave. Oftentimes even helping build the countries after we leave and, frankly, even giving them stuff that benefits them and doesn't benefit us. When I was in Taiwan, I was of course at the election rally for the DPP, which won, and a young man came up to me, and of course, I assume he was Taiwanese, but he, broke in English, and he said to me, "Thank you." He was American. "Thank you." He goes, "This entire area of the world would not exist if it wasn't for America." He said Japan would not be what it is today if Americans didn't build it. South Korea would be under communism if Americans didn't defend it. Taiwan wouldn't exist without the defense of the United States. A lot of countries in that region that are some of the strongest economies on the face of the planet are there and exist as such because America helped build them. We've asked for very little in return as a country for this type of thing. Back to the point, though, on the idea of will these globalists try to drag us into a war. A ground war in America would be almost impossible in terms of roads and logistics and mountainous regions and supply networks, and not to mention Appalachia-stan, what we call it. I would feel sorry for any UN force trying to roll through Appalachia, or Florida for that matter. America geographically is like a military bastion. It would be extremely difficult to ever launch a ground war here. Not to mention the strength of the U.S. military, divisions of, let's say, political leanings within our military. A lot of the military tends to lean more conservative and would oppose such things. You'd have a lot of people defecting or becoming silent supporters of course, the opposition. You also have across the United States Americans armed to the teeth and including with equipment better than what most militaries have. your average guy living in a trailer in like, the Florida, the Florida Everglades might have better military equipment than soldiers of some of the top militaries on earth. And this is kind of normal for us, Not to mention the fact that as a gun culture, Americans target shoot for fun. You don't find that in a lot of countries. When I was in Taiwan, they're pushing to get people BB guns to practice shooting. And for me, I was like, "Are you serious?" I was like, "That's a kid's toy." In some of these countries, they're treated like deadly weapons, and they take training with them very seriously. It's we're unique as a country, and I don't think we understand how unique we are. It would be almost impossible to conquer America using military force. Not to mention just the fighting spirit of Americans. You would have to conquer us down to the most minute individual, because I'd guarantee Americans would not surrender. That being said as well, though, I think our weakness is not there. Our weakness is more in terms of cultural subversion, moral subversion, and the other types of whittling away of our integrity as a nation using war by other means, which is, of course, the focus of unrestricted warfare by the CCP, ideological subversion by the Soviets and now the Russians, and I would say internal subversion by different communist groups operating within the United States who've gotten their way into our political system. Chip, last question. You're saying, if there were a war between China and Taiwan, would there be an uprising of Chinese people against the CCP in the mainland and in Hong Kong, and maybe even Tibet? Or because the people don't have guns, would they just do nothing? Without a doubt, the Chinese Communist Party is deeply concerned about internal instability. And of course, if they were to launch a war against Taiwan, it would also bring an opening for India possibly to start a ground war, for Japan very rapidly getting pulled into that. Japan being part of the Quad Alliance, that would mean Australia, the United States, and again, India getting pulled into it. Vietnam might try something. South Korea, I don't think they'd do anything personally because they're dealing with North Korea. But you would definitely have a regional war start, and without a doubt, you'd have a lot of Chinese internally in China who already don't like the CCP very much, possibly doing so as well. There's a movement called the Tweedong movement, the Quit the CCP movement. And for the last maybe over a decade, Chinese people in the mainland have been stating their withdrawal from the Chinese Communist Party, the Youth League, and the Young Pioneers. The number is somewhere over 400 million currently. And understand what that means. That's like a Gandhi-like peaceful resistance happening within China, where the CCP has been decayed from within. It is disintegrating from within. People are simply stating their withdrawals and saying they're not going to be part of it. And I understand that there's been talk of people even in the Chinese military who align with this anti-CCP idea to a very large extent, to the point where many of them even talked about launching coups inside of China. And I believe that's also part of the context of why Xi Jinping is launching purges right now within his own military. So I do think there's concerns in that. All right, folks, that said, join us again tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And thank you so much for being here. Please share this episode. Help us get the word out. Thank you all so much. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free.